distinguished guests, the students, professors, ambassador of Republic of Poland, rector, community members. My name is Nomeda Gudelienė, and I'm advisor to Deputy Rector on Sustainable Development here at Mykolas Romeris University, Lithuania. And I will moderate today's exclusive lecture, The Future of Global Cooperation is Circular, by Jonathan Glennie. The event is organized by Kapuscinski Development Lecture Series in partnership with the European Commission and the United Nations Development Programme. Respect to human dignity, peaceful co-living, appreciating different cultures and backgrounds, all humanity living in solidarity and harmony, engaging in lifelong learning, exchanging resources, have the greatest value and dreams of philosophers and thought constructors behind all civilizations throughout centuries. However, we people fail, sometimes harder, sometimes easier. Pandemias, wars, armed conflicts, climate change, natural disasters throughout the world, migration, uneven distribution of powers, and distortion of economical change and exchange affect each and every one of us. And today, they seem even closer and more threatening them than a decade or 2 decades ago, at least from Lithuania's perspective. To face the challenges of our times wisely, we have to learn from the past thinkers and innovate, find new ways, new methods of understanding, constructing, and deconstructing our world and reality. Today, we will have an exclusive opportunity to hear an interesting presentation of how our modern world can be reconstructed with regard to circular cooperation between different nations, between different people. And I believe that the thought we will hear soon will contribute to the debate and formulation of the European and global development policy. To understand the historical context, I would like to mention briefly about Ryszard Kapuscinski. He was a Polish philosopher and journalist who traveled the world for 50 years making reports where he would travel. And often he was called the voice of the poor. He focused on covering developing countries, clashes of cultures, revolutions, and liberation struggles. His approach and profound respect to people he met challenged conventional understanding of world structures. And his books were very influential and translated into modern 40 languages. Among them, he was most famous for The Emperor, a little reportage on Ethiopia, Shah of Shahs, an account of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, The Shadow of the Sun, a witness of the end of colonial rule in Africa, Another Day of Life, covering Angola, civil war, the Imperium, a look at the decline of the Soviet Union, and other. Building on Ryszard Kapuscinski's heritage and understanding on human co-living, it is now our time to contribute to the development of our civilization. And coming back to Mykolas Romeris University, we have been a social sciences university. We care very much about each person and what is going on in our country and other countries of the world. And now I would like to invite Professor Lira Jakulevičienė, the Dean of our School of Law, to make an introductory address. Professor Jakulevičienė, the floor is yours.
Excellency Ambassador, dear Rector, dear guests, dear colleagues, dear students, it is really a great pleasure, a big honor on behalf of the Law School of Mykolas Romeris University to welcome you all, to welcome first of all our guest, Jonathan Glennie, a very distinguished speaker, also all of you on this occasion. And when I think about Kapuscinski lectures, I have a very good feeling because it brings my memories back more than 10 years ago when I was involved in organization of the first lectures, Kapuscinski lectures in Lithuania. At that time, we were discussing about the impact of economic crisis on development cooperation. And at that time, we were in Vilnius University. So today, it is a particular honor, particular pleasure to announce the Kapuscinski lecture here at Mykolas Riomeris University. If we speak about international cooperation, I think now is more than ever that it is relevant, it is acute, whether we would speak about migration, climate change, security issues, any other aspects. We understand very clearly, even in the tiny Lithuania, seemingly far away from all of the troubles, now in recent years we understood very, very clearly and very painfully that we cannot stay apart and that international cooperation, this is something that is about solutions to these problems. We cannot solve it as a state, we cannot solve it even as a region. And as Richard Kapuscinski was saying, that we don't understand our own problems if we don't place them, if we don't put them, if we don't think about them in a global planet scale, as he was saying. And of course, in the legal field here in Lithuania, we used to be very, very focused on the national law, on national developments, on just legal aspects, without looking into international politics, international economics, security, and so on. But since recently, as I was already saying, we understand very, very much the interlinkages. And in response also to understanding that we have to learn and we have to understand how to cooperate internationally, it seems, what is this? You really have to understand and know how to cooperate internationally. In recognition of this need, we have launched, even in the law field, we have launched the bachelor program on law and global security. And I'm glad to see also the students of this program here today that are coming from different parts of the world to discuss legal but also global security issues. Because we cannot just solve it from the legal perspective or from the security perspective or just at the national level. We have to cooperate. But as I said, to cooperate and to promote international cooperation and to be, most importantly, to be successful, we need to learn. We need to learn a lot because we all are different in our own ways, in our different approaches, in our different style, geographies, policies, and many, many things to say. So Kapuscinski lectures for me, and I really expect that it will be also for you, is the best way to learn from the best. That's why we're very, very proud and glad to have you here today. We're very much looking forward to your thinking, as Nomed already mentioned, to different thinking, because if we try to solve the things in the same way that we have not solved for so many years, then, of course, we will not have a nice future that we would like to have for our children. So I would like to thank our speaker today very much to come all along from Latin America with some stopovers in Europe. And I would like to thank very much the organizers without whom these lectures from 2009, when they were happening in Lithuania, would not have happened. The United Nations Development Program, the European Commission, and of course, my dear colleagues at Mykolas Riomeris University and director who said that, yes, we have to be on board and we have to have Kapuscinski lectures here at this university because we are very international, we believe in international cooperation, and we believe that our world is really very small. So thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity, and dear colleagues, dear students, please use this opportunity and enjoy it also. Thank you very much.
Thank you very very much, Dean, for your kind input. And this public lecture would be impossible without a contribution of the European Commission. Now I would like to invite to make an address a communication head of European Commission representation in Lithuania, Eglė Strungytė.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here today with you. And I would like to thank you, first of all, our host, Mykolas Romeris University, for their support. I'd also like to thank the United Nations Development Programme, which has partnered with the European Commission on the Kapuscinski Development Lectures series since 2009. As already mentioned today, the Kapuscinski Development Lectures offer the opportunity to learn and discuss development issues such as climate change, economic, green transition, and others. These high-level events contribute to the debate and formation of also the European development policy. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest, Jonathan Glennie, has for many years been one of the foremost voices challenging the way the world implements development cooperation, promoting cooperation that is more effective, more respectful, and more fair. His topic today, the future of global cooperation is circular, is very timely. We have all seen how unfair and unequal have been the impacts of crises such as COVID, climate change, the recent conflicts, the war in Ukraine. Our collective response has to be carefully framed and delivered. The European Union has for many years been moving away from a binary model of development policy and cooperation, of providing and receiving, to more equal partnerships in international cooperation with mutual commitment and critical learning on both sides. The European Union New Global Gateway, an innovative strategy to mobilize 300 billion of investments over strategic autonomy and resilience in partner countries, is based firmly on this concept of shared objectives, win-win actions, and mutual benefits. So we are heading on the right track, but of course, there's far more we can do to improve the situation. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing from Jonathan how the European Union and other international partners can improve the quality of cooperation with our partner countries in a truly mutual way in support of global prosperity and sustainability. Thank you, and looking forward to the lecture.
This public lecture would be possible without United Nations Development Programme. Now I would like to invite to make an address team leader, UNDP Regional Bureau in Europe, Oana Rebedie. Please.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here, and thank you for making time to join this lecture. It's everything you said is making actually my statement and my address much easier, because it's indeed the spirit of global cooperation that is going to get us through the global challenges of today, which are increasingly more complex and more complicated. First of all, I would like to thank the Mykolas Romeris University for hosting us in their university, but also for hosting us the second time in Lithuania. I also like to thank Jonathan Glennie for accepting the invitation to speak about this important topic, which for UNDP and for the UN is something that we are trying to increasingly focus our efforts on. Looking forward to your address, but also thanking our partners from the European Commission for being partners in this initiative from 2009. And as you mentioned, this initiative is supposed to increase the awareness of students in general, but the general public around global issues, development issues, but also further the understanding of global agendas like the Sustainable Development Goals or the Paris Agreement for climate change. And I saw an interesting, one of the interesting slides that you have about the achievement and where we are on the SDGs, and I'm looking forward to discussing this as well. Since 2009, we have been working together on this important initiative, but it's also in honoring, and as you mentioned, Ryszard Kapuscinski, which is a Polish journalist and writer who was mostly interested in the human development of all people and of their aspirations and dreams and limitations and prospects. And I think this is the spirit of the lecture today, of the topic of what we're discussing today. I think the imperative of the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, but also the global challenges that we are facing can no longer confine global cooperation to the traditional paradigm of the North providing aid to the South. It's about collaborative partnerships that recognize the interdependence and share responsibilities of all countries, but also all actors, irrespective of the economic status of them, of their context. But South-South cooperation, and this is something that I also wanted to focus a little bit on, it's something that we're also doing in the Bureau of Europe and Central Asia quite a lot, but also globally as UNDP. It plays an indispensable role in today's development landscape. It represents a shared vision among the peoples and the countries of the South that is shaped by close historical realities, similar development pathways, as well as shared challenges. UNDP has been increasing its efforts to promote and sustain South-South cooperation. We also host the UN Office for South-South Cooperation proudly for almost 4 decades, but we're also implementing this in different regions, and I wanted to come back to this because in Europe and Central Asia, where I'm representing now UNDP, we have been a strong advocate of South-South, but also East-East cooperation. And we have been working with partners that we call emerging partners, but they are already establishing themselves in the development arena, like Slovakia, Czech Republic, Poland, to establish systems of knowledge sharing to help the countries make the transitions they want to make in their development pathways. For instance, with Slovakia, which has an interesting model of public financing to transition to a market economy, we are helping other countries in the Western Balkans and Eastern Europe to adopt these models. Or with Poland and Czech Republic, we work with the private sector to identify innovative solutions to development issues that we are exporting then to developing countries. So this is of utmost importance for the countries because I think it's no longer about providing only aid, it's about providing solutions, providing technological advances, providing interesting innovations that are happening in different startups everywhere that we can definitely explore and scale up. Moreover, South-South cooperation is no longer only government to government. It's about increasingly engaging a variety of different actors and development partners. The private sector, as I was saying, can bring innovative financing to allow developing countries to share good practices. And I'm not only talking about financing, I'm also talking about their solutions, resources, and also expertise that can be of impact, but not only in developing countries, but developed countries alike. For instance, just recently, UNDP launched an interesting report on the private sector solutions for waste management ecosystems, leveraging South-South cooperation. And we are looking now at an ecosystem of 12 big cities in the South and seeing what are the private-led solutions that we can scale up. So it's all about replicating and making sure that the countries have the access to resources they need. So, dear guests, UNDP is just one cog in the wider machine, which works towards and in tandem with the UN system, but also with different partnerships to advance development cooperation and support the global cooperation all over the world. But also academia plays a very important role, and I'm really happy to be here to be part of this discussion and also to hear your lecture and see how we can definitely advance the conversation around these issues. With this in mind, I'm passing the floor back to you, not before welcoming the online participants, and I'm also encourage them to use hashtag CapTalks to put any questions and provide comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. Now it's a great privilege and pleasure for us at Mykolas Romeris University to welcome you, Jonathan Glennie, at our university and to deliver a speech on future of global cooperation is circular. Jonathan is the founder of Global Nation, a renowned scholar in the field of international development and global cooperation. He is also a visionary thinker and researcher. of our societal structures, how international structures are developing. Author of innovative concept of circular cooperation. And he has 20 years working experience in international development, at the same time at NGOs such as Save Children UK or Christian Aid. He is also managing cross-country research projects and advising on high-level strategy and policy that affects each of us in a small country, even Lithuania. Over a decade ago, he proposed a radically new idea in his Guardian column that SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, have to be universal. And they have to be applied to all countries. Today we accept it as a reality, but some 10 years ago it was really an innovative thought. Now he's working on a complementary evolution of the ideas in the way these objectives are funded, relating funding to Sustainable Development Goals, shifting from us to them approach to an aid mentality from power distribution perspective to mentality of global public investment, whereby all countries contribute, all benefit, all make decisions. He is also the author of the Future Aid book, Global Public Investment, that introduced global public investment as a visionary framework for reimagining and reconstructing the landscape of development finance cross-culturally. He is also the author of intriguing and influential publication, The Trouble of Aid. Sometimes it might be tricky, that delves deep into the challenges and opportunities of foreign support. We look forward to your presentation on how 21st century global cooperation needs to evolve towards circularity, to be truly mutual, with all countries contributing and benefiting, fair institutions, even distribution of power and decision making. So, dear Glennie, Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Nomeda, and thank you to all of the introductory speeches. They were really interesting to listen to, and I think they'll link closely to what I have to say today. I'm so happy to be here to give this Kapuscinski lecture. Thank you for the invitation and the welcome. And as you say, Kapuscinski was, of course, very much from this part of the world, born not so far from here, and he documented the end of colonialism and many other aspects of the changing politics of the 20th century. And this lecture is going to be about a new vision for global cooperation in the 21st century. We're hemmed in by conceptual constraints, post-colonial paradigms, 20th century thinking. We need to evolve our understanding of international cooperation and the institutions and processes that carry it out, if we are to have a chance not only to avoid the risks that we face as humanity, but to take advantage of all the opportunities. And the central aspect of the new vision for cooperation is, as we've heard in some of the opening remarks, mutuality. Mutuality. And I'll use the spatial analogy of circularity to bring that home, building on the best of vertical, horizontal, and even triangular approaches that already exist in international cooperation. Now, you might say, hold on, I thought cooperation was mutual by definition, working towards the same end. Well, the reality has been very different. Cooperation has actually been just as frequently a euphemism for top-down charity in the best cases and top-down pressure in the worst cases. The fundamental shift we need to see in 21st century international cooperation is from us and them to just us. And if we don't make that shift, we will fail to bring together the kind of strong, sustainable, effective cooperation that we need as humanity. So I'll be taking you through, firstly, the mess we're in, then why we're in this mess, and then the principles of a new era of mutual, circular cooperation to get us out of it. with a particular focus, as we've heard, on something we're calling global public investment. And finally, I'll explain why I'm hopeful that we can indeed do this. So let's start with the mess. A pandemic that shut everything down, an economic collapse that is leading to rising, possibly unpayable debts in most countries and causing economic havoc, unemployment on the rise, less money for social services, rising social tensions, a climate crisis that's becoming daily more evident and frightening, the threat of not knowing what the hell artificial intelligence is going to become, armed conflicts, and in this part of the world that's all too obvious, but in many parts of the world, rising migration related to all of these things, tensions between the great powers and disunity among the countries in the global south and global north, leading to doubts regularly voiced about the future of multilateralism. This year's Sustainable Development Progress Report announced that only 12% of our Sustainable Development Goal targets are on track. So now more than ever, we need global solidarity. Solidarity, as my co-founder at Global Nation, Hassan Damlouji, has said, is the golden thread that offers hope for a planet in which we all thrive in the 21st century. Solidarity is the difference, for example, between 1.5 degrees of global warming and 4 degrees or more. It's the difference between millions of the most vulnerable people dying in a new pandemic and rapid, coordinated action to stop that pandemic ever taking hold. But when we published the first Global Solidarity Report, which you can see behind me, in September this year, we had somber news to share. We're seeing solidarity reduce at the global level. According to our Global Solidarity Scorecard, we are in the danger zone. And what about the money side? The independent high-level expert group on climate finance concluded in 2022 that an additional $2.4 trillion is needed every year by 2030 to meet the climate finance needs of the planet. And a recent report of the High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism put that figure at nearer $4 to $7 trillion per year. And we haven't even been able to muster the $100 billion of climate finance promised 8 years ago in Paris. Traditional multilateral funding approaches are struggling to adapt their decades-old design and mandates to 21st century geopolitics. The first decades or so of this century were focused on aid effectiveness and more effective development cooperation. And there have been some important successes. We must never forget that. The strides made by the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria, for instance, or the strong international focus on women's rights and girls' education. There are many more that many of you may have been working on. But as we enter the second quarter of this century, efforts to update aid and development cooperation seem tired. Initiatives to expand and improve international cooperation to the scale so obviously required seem to come up against political barriers presented as inevitable. Replenishments of important global funds follow the traditional model of asking for funding every few years, but without a formula, responsibility, or predictability. Reforms proposed to the ODA system, Official Development Assistance, are welcome but lack depth. There is talk of decolonizing aid, but can you decolonize something that might be, by its very makeup and history, colonial? We are miles away from where we need to be. We're driving a broken down car without any fuel. The world needs a coherent, ambitious, effective global response to the multiple challenges it faces. We need all corners of our world to be pulling together. But instead, we face a crisis of multilateralism, incoherence, lack of vision, and therefore inevitably weak and ineffective attempts at cooperation. Just look at the forthcoming climate conference, COP28, next month. Sadly, I've lost count of the number of people that ask me if it's worth going because they feel it won't achieve anything. And it's not just because global leaders are failing, and it's not just because it's a fiendishly difficult political context, although both of those are true. But the more I've studied this over the years, the more I've realized that a major reason our institutions are struggling is the outdated way we've been taught to think about global cooperation. The dominant aid paradigm cooked up about 80 years ago, is preventing the world's nations from taking the steps we desperately need to reform and rebuild our world. The world's grand experiment with foreign aid began in the aftermath of a devastating world war. The vision behind it is perhaps best articulated by US President Harry Truman in his address in 1949, which called for a bold new program for making the benefits of our scientific advances and industrial progress available for the improvement and growth of underdeveloped areas. And aid has been through many changes over the years, from the big push rhetoric of the 1960s, the setting of the 0.7% target for wealthy OECD countries in 1970, structural adjustment in the 80s and 90s, and then the era of the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, for the first 15 years of this century, which saw a renewed focus on social sector spending. At different times and in different places, foreign aid has focused on everything from infrastructure, agriculture, manufacturing, conflict prevention, human rights, women's equality, health and education, institution building, environmental protection, emergency response, pretty much everything else. The current fad is using aid to leverage private capital in support of economic development. So many areas. But while aid has had many faces, two of the most fundamental aspects of the aid narrative have remained unchanged. I call them conceptual constraints. And until we break through them, we will remain unable to build the cooperation system that we now need. So let's take them in turn. First, the aid is temporary. Temporary support to help foreign countries out of exceptional difficulties related to poverty and poor governance, while other financial options like taxes and private investment are unavailable. Aid, in this theory, will eventually end when the economies of recipient countries are big enough, leaving aid departments in the EU, in the UK, in the US, elsewhere, to close their doors for the last time. And second, that aid is a transfer of money and knowledge from richer, quote, developed countries to poorer, quote, developing ones. Aid is a charitable endeavor with self-described donors calling the shots on how and where it is spent. Donor, recipient, us and them. But that's wrong on both counts. We need a permanent and growing system of international cooperation, not a temporary, diminishing one. And it needs to include all parts of the world as contributors, not just the global north. So first, the idea that aid is temporary. The challenges facing the world have evolved and expanded. Eradicating extreme poverty remains a central focus of international cooperation, but it's obviously no longer the only priority. As living standards improve in many parts of the world, so do expectations. And meanwhile, the environmental challenge, from saving forests to cleaning up the oceans and ultimately the need for humanity to address climate change, is more urgent than ever. Add to that a list of international policy issues that seems to be getting longer all the time. Peace and security, controlling communicable diseases, most recently COVID-19, science and research, organized crime, to name just a few. You've already got a long shopping list of top priority items requiring a very large wallet. Rapid technological advance creates opportunities, but it also raises risks and uncertainty. And meanwhile, structural inequalities remain fully intact, with many indicators of inequality worsening in recent decades. We need far more money, better spent, to support global prosperity and counter global threats. But rather than planning for the expansion of cooperation that is so desperately required, our aid system is actually constructed for a gradual shutdown. This shutdown is built into the theory of aid, a bit like the obsolescence famously built into old-fashioned light bulbs and possibly your iPhones, gradually narrowing its focus onto those countries arbitrarily described as low income, until one day, finally, the whole era of aid, which started with that speech by Harry Truman, comes to an end. And any number of quotes could demonstrate this. Take Donald Kaberuka, a former president of the African Development Bank, who said, "Aid is not successful unless it has a sell-by date. If aid does not stop, it will have failed." Or Barack Obama put it succinctly, as one would expect, foreign assistance is not an end in itself. The purpose of aid must be to create the conditions where it is no longer needed. And according to Paul Collier, an influential British academic, there's basically no role for international development cooperation in middle-income countries. Almost all countries are now either middle-income or high-income. And that's been the view in the aid business for years. It's the logical consequence of traditional assumptions about aid and the implication of economic theories that have been rolled out to support it. It's also the expectation, importantly, of the tax-paying publics whose money is being spent. But it is wrong. In my work on international development and cooperation over the last 2 decades, I've become convinced that the era of large-scale public investment in international progress and development is not coming to an end. Quite the contrary. It's only just beginning. In fact, it's taken on a new importance as humanity grapples with rising inequality and unsustainability to add to the central challenge of poverty reduction. Fine, you say. So we need more money, but won't private money do? And can't poorer countries pay with their own taxes? And can't we ask billionaires to help out with their philanthropy? When the countries of the world met in Addis Ababa in 2015 to discuss how to fund the Sustainable Development Goals that they were soon to acclaim, that was certainly the vibe. Ramp up other types of money, private, domestic, philanthropic. But public finance has a unique set of characteristics at the international level as well as the national level, which mean it cannot simply be replaced by other types of money. A different motivation, higher levels of concessionality, more flexibility, including counter-cyclicality, including being counter-cyclical, simple availability, and different channels of accountability. So even when other funds become available, public money is still often the best type of finance for so many interventions. Not a last resort, but a first resort, as the economist Marina Mazzucato is keen on saying, prodding societies in the right direction and promoting global benefits. It's not just the quantity of a particular type of money that matters, it's what type of money that is, the quality of the money. And the role of public money remains crucial for our world. So it's quite obvious that we need more global solidarity, more cooperation, and more public money at the international level to spend on crucial joint global objectives. If that's the problem, then the solution, in my view, is to change the way we think about international cooperation and make it more mutual. And let me first give you some good news. Despite the unremittingly grey cloud of post-COVID problems, there does seem to be one fairly consistent silver lining, a new readiness to name structural injustices, whether related to race, gender, or geography, and a call for fundamental changes in global institutional architecture in a way that seemed unlikely only a few years ago, and I've been working on this for a long time. Young people seem particularly impatient with glossing over unpalatable historical realities or tinkering with manifestly outdated approaches. Meanwhile, post-capitalism, post-neoliberalism, and post-colonialism are activities now funded by the world's universities and foundations. We are no longer in the era of improving aid, but decolonizing it, an altogether more profound objective. But while the speeches of global leaders seek to present a sector that's moved on from the days of patronizing pleas to feed the starving, in its underlying assumptions and dominant institutions, how much has really changed? The World Bank is still the World Bank. The UN Security Council looks a lot like it used to. The OECD, Club of Rich Countries, still sits in Paris to discuss how to spend aid. And the fundamental division remains at the heart of what we call development cooperation. The idea that some countries are developed, while others, the majority, are underdeveloped, undeveloped, developing, depending on the latest iteration found in university textbooks. This is the theoretical basis upon which the development industry has built its edifice. Progress is to be found in one part of the world, namely Europe and North America, and other parts of the world need to look north for answers and help. While presented today in terms of generosity and charity, in terms of aid, rather than oppression and extraction, it's nevertheless hard to imagine a more colonial mentality. The process of building the SDGs appeared to have broken through this narrative with universal aspirations for all countries, not just so-called developing countries. But global cooperation has lagged behind, still largely communicated as top-down, one way, not really cooperation at all in the sense of mutual assistance, rather more transactional, with so-called donors offering support to recipients. And that means that while aid has often been a force for good, it's also been misused and wasted, in part due to the institutions and processes through which it's managed. Aid governance is stuck in the 20th century, with a handful of countries taking the major decisions and contributions fluctuating depending on donor circumstances. An improved system of global cooperation requires more democratic decision-making about the size, purpose, and accountability of contributions, moving away from a donor-recipient mentality and towards more respectful partnerships with all countries and other stakeholders, including civil society, sat at the decision-making table. So there's no easy answer to the problem of global governance. Power remains power. But if we get it right, we could push new types of partnership, which will be the difference between an era of global progress and one in which we're unable to curtail the constant jostling of nation-states for supremacy. The good news, more good news, is that countries are more closely connected than ever before, expanding opportunities for states and societies to collaborate on issues of shared concern. As historically poorer countries do better economically, all countries are increasingly contributing to solving the world's problems. The fact that some leading countries are currently going through a kind of blinkered isolationism does not change these fundamentals. So we need a bigger, better organized, long-term system of global cooperation in which all countries are fully a part, from poverty to inequality and sustainability, from national progress to international goods, from north-south to mutual, from voluntary to contributory, from charity to investment, from foreign to global, from transactional to cooperative, from ad hoc to structured, from temporary to permanent, from stingy to sufficient, from them and us to simply us. With colleagues in the new Global Public Investment Network, we've come up with 3 core principles for cooperation in the 21st century. All contribute, building on the SDG principle of universality and challenging the donor-recipient dichotomy of traditional aid. All benefit, resources channeled towards internationally agreed global objectives such as climate stability, pandemic prevention, allocated regionally and nationally. And all decide. Becoming co-contributors rather than recipients strengthens the Global South's demand for a stronger voice in decision-making, a more representative structure globally and in particular projects, including civil society, leading to enhanced accountability and effectiveness. And these principles can be applied to all types of global cooperation. And we're now going to look at 2 main forms of development cooperation: financial and capacity building. Now, if any of you have read anything that I've written in the last few years, you will know that these principles, this new way of thinking, underpins a new system of international public finance that we're calling global public investment. And this graphic behind me is from a new report we've recently published. In place of the insufficient and ineffective funding provided today, our global public investment approach proposes a better governed system of fiscal allocation, a new way to pay for our global objectives. GPI is a solution to the conundrum that we need lots more international public money, much of it in grant form, not just loans, but that it can't come from the aid system, which still has a place, but is increasingly anachronistic. The new international public money cannot be managed in the same top-down, limited way we've become used to. It needs to be based around mutuality, not us and them. All contribute, all benefit, all decide. Countries at all income levels need to participate in the creation of a new financing arrangement, one that recognizes their voices and modernizes accountability processes. Changes in global wealth and power have shaken up international development practice for the better, with emerging economies now contributing more than ever to global objectives. And all countries, even the very poorest, should contribute funds for global sustainable development according to their ability to do so, according to a fair contribution formula. And even the very richest should be able to benefit according to their need. Some will see this as a radical idea. They will be surprised to learn that it's increasingly already the new normal. More money, better decisions, more accountability, more impact. It's very important to note, because it's often a question that's raised, that global public investment is not the only approach to pay for the things we care about globally. And there is still a strong case for large-scale reparations from former colonial powers and from major polluters. And there'll be an ongoing need for humanitarian support in crises which are by their nature located in a particular geography. But the mutuality at the heart of this global public investment approach should be the basis of a new era in global cooperation. The GPI approach affords respect, power, and dignity to countries and communities with fewer financial resources because it recognizes them as globally relevant co-contributors at the international level. So, for instance, spending on global goods and services is not a question of charity, but of sensible investment in mutually beneficial objectives, just like public sector spending at the national level. It should be an obligation for all countries, not a voluntary gift. And while it should expect a return, that return is not a financial one, but rather social and environmental impact for our global common good. But this isn't just about dignity and respect. Mutuality is the key to unlocking and sustaining large-scale global cooperation. You don't get effective cooperation in the 21st century without mutuality. Lower-income countries will see this new approach as a way to build their voice and power. Meanwhile, the richer countries will see it as a way to share responsibility and make the changes we all need to see. In the words of William Ruto, and if you want to look this up on YouTube, it's quite an iconic moment from a recent summit in Paris. William Ruto, the president of Kenya, said on a panel, "We do not want anything for free. We will pay commensurate to our economy, and we want those resources controlled not by the IMF and World Bank, because you have the final say." And he's speaking here to the French president. "We want another organization of equals, where you have as much say because you pay, as we do because we also pay. We need a new financial architecture, where governance, where power is not in the hands of a few people." Okay. Another sip of water. So much for applying our new principles to global finance. But cooperation is not just about money, as we've heard from previous speakers. What about capacity building? And this is where, finally, we come onto the language of circularity. Circular cooperation, I'll explain why we use that language. Why aren't there more Bangladeshi organizations helping Germany with its flood defenses, as the late, great old friend of mine, Salim ul-Haq, used to say? Why aren't there more Colombian organizations advising Norwegians on mental health, or South Africans sharing insights on women's rights in North America? The international cooperation ecosystem still theorizes supposedly developed countries to be the repository of knowledge to be shared with developing countries. Yes, of course, there is more money and resource in some countries than others, and that has implications for global financial responsibility, including redistribution. But it is false to imply that countries in the global north cannot benefit from cooperation with poorer countries, their expertise and solutions they have piloted. Just as it is also false, not to say insulting, to imply that countries in the global south cannot contribute to development in other parts of the world, including much wealthier countries. This becomes an especially urgent point when you add that the development model typical of the global north is not itself sustainable. I always say that I have no problem with the concept of a developing country. All countries are developing. It's the idea that some countries are already developed, which is so terribly arrogant and unhelpful. We all have much to learn. And I know most people listening to this will be nodding in agreement. So how do we build a program model that reflects this insight? Well, that's where the circular cooperation approach comes in. We've already talked about the typically top-down nature of much 20th century international cooperation. This could be described as vertical, as you can see on the slide behind me. In response, and we've heard about this already from the UNDP representative, many countries in the Global South have for many years been carrying out South-South cooperation, which emphasizes horizontal cooperation between peers. The growth in South-South cooperation in recent decades has widened the base of countries contributing to international cooperation and therefore the resources available, and generally emphasized in-country ownership and control of project selection and management. It's worth noting, however, that some South-South cooperation projects are actually quite vertical in nature, think the relationship between China and Zambia, and that horizontal approaches could also describe North-North cooperation, such as the cooperation carried out between European countries. And I hadn't heard of East-East cooperation, but exactly that. It's horizontal in nature. What we mean by horizontal cooperation compared to vertical cooperation is that it's carried out by countries of a similar size or type. In recent years, particularly in Latin America, which is where I live, the concept of triangular cooperation has come to the fore, intended to erode the binary donor-recipient relationship and allow communities of different wealth levels to engage in development projects in a new way, building on complementary strengths. So typically in a triangular cooperation project, a high-income country provides funding, sometimes known as the facilitating partner. A middle-income country provides expertise, sometimes called a pivot partner. And then the development impact is targeted at a lower-income country known as the beneficiary partner. However, even this triangular approach maintains elements of verticality, namely that a poorer country is the beneficiary, is the one to be supported in its development by countries higher up the income scale. So while all these modalities of cooperation are useful and important, they are all in their own way still quite 20th century. Fragility and challenges exist in countries of all income levels, and 21st century patterns of education, mobility, and technology make it increasingly possible for countries and communities at all income levels to contribute and to lead. Positioning the people of one community or country as recipients or beneficiaries, and others as experts or donors, creates barriers to progressing sustainable development across the world. Luckily, this use of spatial analogies to describe these three modes of cooperation, vertical, horizontal, and triangular, allows us to propose the next evolution in international cooperation projects, which we call circular cooperation. And it's an approach that breaks down the north-south donor-recipient divides entirely and treats all countries as both contributors and beneficiaries of development cooperation. It emphasizes that all countries are in transition towards sustainable and dynamic development. None are developed, and that they can be helped by other countries regardless of their relative GDP per capita, because experience, ideas, and wisdom are not the preserve of the wealthier nations. The Millennium Development Goals said the problem is poverty, and that is predominantly located in the Global South, so other countries were asked to help Global South countries to reduce it. It was a 20th century framing. The Sustainable Development Goals say the problem is unsustainability. That is a problem found in different ways in all countries. So we work together as a world to become more sustainable. It's a 21st century framing. And a modern approach to cooperation would emphasize reciprocity. This circular cooperation approach would be the final rejection of a colonial type of thinking that has undermined and continues to undermine global relationships. It breaks down the donor-recipient divide and treats all countries as both co-contributors and co-recipients of ideas, experience, resources, and support. Where one country has more material resources, more wealth, it would contribute more money, but that would not accord it leadership status all countries would jointly strategize and implement a program of work from which all would benefit in different ways. And I want to make the same caveat as I did with global public investment. Other modalities exist and will remain useful. The choice of modality, be it vertical, horizontal, triangular, circular, depends on the context and purpose of the cooperation project, but we should be actively seeking out opportunities to build circular cooperation whenever possible. And themes that lend themselves to circular cooperation in cooperation projects include those where a priori and in practice there is no reason to assume more knowledge and experience in the global north than in the global south. So issues such as human rights, gender equality, urban sustainability, social programs to fight hunger, drug abuse and loneliness, education, conflict resolution, you can all think of many other examples. And there's good news, even more good news. Referring to our representative here from the European Union, that clues to how to build this approach can already be found in the European Union. The European Union showcases what a reciprocal approach to cooperation within a region can look like. Countries club together to solve common problems. The goal of convergence is at the heart of the theory behind the EU structural and cohesion funds, whereby the EU's wealthier countries, including some of the world's major donors, transfer billions to poorer European countries, which are nevertheless wealthy by global standards. And here in Lithuania, it's a great example of a country that's benefited from its membership of the EU and of EU structural funds. With the adoption of the SDGs, the door for applying EU-style thinking to a broader global context seems to be wide open. Countries in Europe do not graduate from aid or concessional assistance upon reaching a certain arbitrary level of income per capita, and notably, even the wealthier countries in the EU grouping, net contributors to the overall pot, and some of the richest countries in the world, also benefit directly from EU grants. The money they receive is generally used to promote social cohesion, generate jobs, invest in green growth, many other objectives. While EU funds do focus on poverty and social cohesion, and special funds for humanitarian responses, their thematic focuses go well beyond these concerns, looking at greater connectivity between countries, infrastructure development, job creation, small business development, etc. The most important aspect of EU fund governance is that because all countries pay in and all receive, so therefore all of them sit round the table to decide how these funds should be spent, much in the way those of us backing a global public investment approach propose at the global level. To be really, really clear, we're not proposing one central budget, as there is in the EU, where everyone goes to Brussels and discusses a particular, one consolidated budget. We're using this as an analogy, and it's going to be more difficult and more complex at the international, global level. But the idea is there. Critical to the theory underpinning the EU funds and to garnering public support for this redistribution of wealth is the recognition that reducing disparities in living standards and building shared infrastructure is important for the progress and security of all parts of the Union, not just the direct recipients of grants. So, coming to the end now, I don't know how I'm doing on time. Mutuality means enhancing human dignity between peoples and communities. It removes power imbalances due to education, wealth and resources, paternalism, causes of dependency and cultural arrogance. Many organizations, governments, communities and experts in the Global South understand and support these concepts without hesitation, in part because their countries are elevated above the status of recipient and take the mantle of contributor. Words matter. They can convey respect or condescension, and too often in the world of aid, it is the latter. The psychological aspects of the development relationship are overlooked by bean counter approaches to impact. But with the self-esteem associated with power and dignity, communities are more motivated to contribute and lead, which could itself mean stronger impact, even in terms of hard outcomes. On the other hand, being classed as co-beneficiaries will assist global North countries to adopt an attitude of humility to counterbalance the hangover of colonial arrogance. GPI and circular cooperation provide a compelling and ethical self-interest rationale for contributions from all types of contributor as continued financing for development may increasingly rely on demonstrating local benefits. And there are mixed messages on public support for international cooperation in Europe and other continents, but some evidence of a positive response to the idea of mutual cooperation. We focused a lot in our development of both of these ideas on co-creation. Co-creation leads to better ideas and more legitimacy. So we've set up a global public investment network, which has member organizations from all over the world building this idea, and we're building circular cooperation in the same way. The great thing about this co-creation approach is that while we already have some clear ideas about how to implement these ideas, there are many other ideas emerging all the time. The more energy there is behind it, the more new ways the principles will be adopted in ways not yet imagined. And as we've developed this approach, it's been exciting to see more and more people back it. And I've given you some quotes from some well-known faces behind me. Top economists like Mariana Mazzucato, Thomas Piketty, Jayati Ghosh, representative governments like Chile, Norway, and Colombia, leading multilateral experts like Helen Clark and Winnie Byanyima, NGO leaders from the One Campaign, Global Citizen, Christian Aid, Civicus, and many more. There have been examples over the years of attempts to circularize cooperation, both financial cooperation and capacity building, some more successful than others. And GPI and circular cooperation are not just important evolutions, they're a better description of what's already beginning to happen. What we now need is a concerted push backed by theory and methodology and led by leading actors in the cooperation ecosystem. And just one final thought before I finally shut up. Our world is in transition. Our world is in transition as power shifts, unbalances, rebalances, demographies and democracies evolve rapidly, technology surges ahead, and our climate changes. It is a time of peril, and we were just discussing this over a cup of coffee. But it's also a time of great opportunity. Anything is possible. And I mean that in the worst sense and the best sense. Tragic possibilities are possible in our lifetimes. But also this perma-crisis that we are living through can lead to changes that have not so far really been contemplated. Changes of the type that brought our current creaking international system into being, and changes that could put us on the right road. When economists like Keynes and others put together the pieces of a new world order after the Second World War, culminating in the Bretton Woods institutions, their ambition and clarity and strategy overcame the inevitable political barriers. They did what was necessary in the face of great global challenges. And I think we're at a similar moment today. We cannot limit our vision to fit 5-year strategy periods or electoral cycles, or what seem to be the current political constraints, which can anyway change in an instant, as we've seen only too clearly in recent years. The fact that nationalist ideologies hold sway in some parts of the world means that internationalists need to fight even harder for their ideas and ideals, rather than self-censor to fit more neatly with what is perceived to be popular and possible. We need to make more persuasive arguments based on evidence and touching people's hearts as well as their minds. Cooperation is important in its own right to fight poverty and promote sustainability, but it's also the guardrail to help the nations of our world work better together on tense issues like trade and conflict. There's never been a better moment to stress the importance of internationalism and global cooperation for just and sustainable progress, with mutuality as its guiding principle. Thank you.
Your insightful and courageous and innovative approach. I am very happy that our students can hear your speech, and they will go through international organizations, like in 5-10 years period. They will go to their home countries and hear, and I believe that they will bring the idea of mutual cooperation, that countries need to cooperate, people need to cooperate, and to pull out resources for international public investment together. I have much hope that your message will go far beyond this room, beyond this online translation, broadcasting. And now it's the time for questions. Maybe we have some questions from the audience.
Hello. First of all, thank you for your lecture, but I have some questions. You were discussing the fields of financial mutual cooperation and the cooperation in the field of ideas. Let's start with financial cooperation. You were saying it should be mutually beneficial for all sides, but if it would be, we will see today that public money is invested in these regions. The fact that you are suggesting to make it, and it's a quote, an obligation and not a voluntarily act, is because investors for the public money do not see any profit of investment. What they see is how this money is then, for example, used by terrorists, for example, Hamas, to shoot innocent people. So the question is, what can we get from them? What can they offer us? Okay, maybe it's not money, maybe it's ideas. You were saying that, again, in this field, we should mutually benefit, we should get some ideas from them, we should get their solutions. But do we need their solutions? Look at where we are and look where they are. What ideas can they offer? And what I'm asking is maybe it's time for us to understand that we are not, in fact, equal. Maybe we should understand that the process and the idea of the global north spreading progress to the global south is not a colonial mistake. Maybe we should agree that IMF should have the final word, because in the other case, if we allow them to see R as their equals, at some point we may find ourselves at their level. Thank you.
Honestly, I just don't know how to reply to that. I don't know how to reply to that. It's just, it does not, we're not starting from the same place. So I'm not sure. I mean, I could make it, we could get into kind of the politics of that. I mean, does anyone else from the panel feel like answering that? Yeah, well, let's take it as a comment. I mean, I could, but I mean, I just feel like it's just so far away from the basis of where I'm coming from. So let me just very briefly answer. If you feel or others feel that indeed there aren't any answers to be had from other parts of the world that could benefit this part of the world or wherever we're sitting, if you feel that there aren't mutually beneficial objectives that we can all work on together, then we're just going to disagree. And I would possibly suggest that you travel more.
Thank you very much for your answer.
If I may, just of course this comment is provocative. So, but just to give you an example where sometimes we think that we are somewhat better or more industrialized or more developed in these terms, and somebody else who is less developed and so on. So just take the example of the problems that industrialized countries are facing with all pollution and all other problems that some of those countries, which you would say maybe they are poorer or they are less developed, they have better environment. So in that respect, I liked really very much what you were saying as a bottom line, that we are all in transition vis-a-vis the sustainability, vis-a-vis the sustainable development goals, because this differentiation, it depends on with what you compare. And if you compare the situation in environmental field, maybe those countries which are considered, okay, they are different from us, they cannot compare with us, maybe they are even in a better situation. So I think everything is relative, and that's why I really liked what you say about this bottom line, that if we compare everybody on the bottom line of sustainability, then we will see that somewhere we in the north, we are failing, and some countries in the south, they are actually in a much better situation. That's the first thing that I wanted to say. Another aspect that I would like to our presenter to maybe in a few words to dwell, again, this is a huge topic, but somehow I also, maybe I will also be a little bit provocative. I got the impression that you are promoting more the public money. Maybe it's a wrong impression, but from your speech, I understood that it's good when there is a public money investment into global cooperation, into mutuality. Now, if we focus on the public money, the problem sometimes is that, again, and I don't want to say that there are some sides, but there is a lot of criticism that the problem with using public money is the way how they are being used, how it is being controlled, about effectiveness, efficiency, whether it really reaches those needs that exist. So there is a lot of criticism about that. And then when you think about private money, then usually maybe again it's a stereotype that it's more effective, it's efficient, there is much more control, the spending is not kind of loose, it's everything very, very clearly structured with the responsibility and so on. So then I'm just thinking, what is the basis? Maybe you could dwell in a couple of sentences for this approach that sort of public money, investment of public money is better. Because when I think just again about concrete examples, countries neighboring some conflict countries, let's say if we take Middle East, and you have refugees for many, many years in the refugee camps. And international organizations are getting, let's say, 40% funding for the needs that they need to cover. 40%. That means people cannot eat, people cannot drink water, people cannot go to school, people cannot work, and so on and so forth. And when you think whether funding, let's say, through public money and through international organizations like that is more effective, or if, let's say, we would have private sector coming to those neighboring countries because they're not in conflict. They are stable countries. Of course, they have big flows of refugees. But if, let's say, those public sector companies, multinationals, if they would move their factories there, and if they would create job opportunities, then you would not need to feed people in the camp, and they could go and get a job and be in dignity for their children, provide education, and so on. So I don't have an answer, but I just, having listened to what you were saying about more public investment vis-a-vis, let's say, the private investment, so just to provoke maybe short answer, if it could be short, on this provocative issue, or maybe it's not provocative at all, and that you already covered by the methods that you are suggesting and solutions you're suggesting. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, look, I'm also going to try and think through how I'm going to answer the question from the young man in the audience, because I don't want to just kind of ignore it, but it threw me. I think maybe because of the way you asked it. But let me take that one first. So yeah, this is about public money. And there is absolutely a place for private money. I don't think that case has to be made. So I think where we're sitting at the moment in 2023 is we're emerging from 3 or 4 decades, maybe more, of what has been termed neoliberalism. Yeah, it started in the late 70s. That has dominated my whole lifetime. The case that it's been quite successful in many countries, the case that the public sector has to be reduced, that it's quite inefficient, the private sector that is generally more efficient and needs to take more space. I think we're emerging from that. I don't think it was ever true. It was a reaction to maybe imbalances in the economies of the 60s and 70s. But now I think we're moving to an era where, and you can see it in the policies of so many countries, especially since the crash of the late 2000s, that the role of the public sector at the national level is being respected a lot more than it ever was. Well, certainly has been for the last 30 or 40 years. Of course, the private sector is the motor of growth, but the role of the public sector in investing in the right places, in leading, in coordinating, and there's so much work on this, and again, to mention Marina Mazzucato, the work she's done, emphasizing that the public money is not just a last resort to fill gaps in the market, but is very much a first resort to lead progress. I think that case has been made strongly at the national level, and I think it's very convincing. And what we're doing is applying that case at the international level. So I mentioned that meeting in Addis Ababa in 2015, where the world talked about how we're going to fund all the Sustainable Development Goals, the hugely ambitious set of goals. And there was a lot of emphasis on the need for much more private money and domestic money, so increases in taxation domestically and a bit on philanthropy. But the most pressure was on private money. And there wasn't that much pressure on increasing ODA, aid, because it was considered that public money at the international level is so small compared to the 2.4 trillion or 3 or 4 trillion that is required that really it's irrelevant. That was very much the kind of implication. Now, two things that I think happened in the last 7-8 years, two realizations. Firstly, that private money has not materialized. So while we need it, your private money obviously needs to make a return. And when there isn't a return to be made, you do have to go back to public money, and that's the case I was making. Now, the argument is, well, there's just not enough. I make the argument that we have to build. That's why I say we're not at the end of an era of international public spending. We're at the beginning. And the analogy I make is, well, you could make the analogy with the European Union itself, which in the 50s and 60s didn't have the structural funds, and now they're a huge part of what makes the European Union work. Someone had to have the vision to insist on those. And even if you look at national spending, if you go back 100 years, in most countries, the public sector as a proportion of national economies was 5 or 10%. In most European countries, we're now looking at 25, 30, 35%. That is a huge change in the way that we see national economies over a period of 100 years, which is a very short period historically. And what I'm saying is that the 21st century, which we're still almost at the beginning of, has to be the century in which we have a similar shift at the global level that we've had at the European level in the last 50 years and the national level in the last 100 years. It will never get up to those huge numbers that were 30, 35% of the economy. It will be 1 or 2%. But it's not diminishing, it's increasing, because even though it's small compared to private money, it's absolutely crucial. And sometimes, saying something is small, it doesn't make it irrelevant. It makes it even more important. Increasingly people, I think, are agreeing with that. And there's going to be another meeting called Financing for Development in a year or two. And I think you'll find there that there's been a realization that the role of international public money is crucial and needs to be safeguarded, but also changed, as I've set out in this meeting.
Thank you very much for your elaborate answer, and I appreciate the notion that we are in academia, we have different approaches, different opinions, students and professors. We can challenge each other's mind. And as our meeting is also broadcasted online, we have also some questions from online audience, for example, from Rwanda. From other countries, and there are topics like also private sector versus public money investment. We also have questions regarding circular cooperation model. For example, another provocative question. The North is not going to embrace your new model because it doesn't want to let go the colonial mentality. How can we bring political pressure to change this dynamic? Like, where is this pressure going to come from? How can we mobilize global public pressure? Maybe some other panelists also would like to join. So how to make it? How to make people to come to consensus, to agreement?
Well, it's really, really hard. It's really, really hard. And, it's hard enough to come up with the right policies. To study them in academia, to turn them into policies that are applicable in politics, but then to actually message that to your publics. That's why the work of a politician is, in a sense, a lot harder than the work of a writer, because to message that and to persuade your publics of a particular approach is is really, really hard. And indeed, the question from the gentleman in the audience demonstrates that. You know, it's not a consensus. And maybe I shouldn't have assumed that it was, that every country in the world has something to offer every other. It's not a consensus that spending money on reducing climate change all over the world, that reducing conflict in other parts of the world, that investing in nature and biodiversity, it's not a consensus that that's in our interests. Maybe quite a popular view within this room, but we need to somehow message that. And that is not my area of expertise. That is an area that a lot of campaigners are working on. How do we persuade the countries, especially in the global north, the powerful countries, that it is indeed in their own interests to invest in other parts of the world? And I would argue, and it's weird for a Brit saying this at the moment, and you saw my tragic red cross on the map of the European Union, but I would argue that the European Union again is an example where we have persuaded the general publics of Europe that large-scale transfers of money are in the interests of the whole of that group of countries. Why? Perhaps it was the link to the calamity of the Second World War, and that's when Europe tore itself apart again. And that's what led to the growth of the European Union, the gradual organization of the European Union, and the gradual increase in these funds that have been transferred first to the south, to southern European countries, and then more recently to Eastern European countries, backed by certainly the politicians of all countries. And yeah, ultimately, Great Britain voted out of that, I think tragically. And I think ultimately the case hadn't been made sufficiently. So it's a good question. How do one continue to make that case? And I think one has to, and this is just a very easy thing to say, but one has to start from where people are at. And it's quite easy, ultimately, like I say, for me to come here and kind of give these kind of big visions of a better world. But ultimately, we have to persuade people and start where they're at. And listen to them. And then I guess that takes me to the gentleman. I think that the struggle I had in answering your question was it was so far apart from where I was starting from. So you raised the issue of money going to Hamas and Gaza. Of course, there are, when you have a huge global system of transfer of money, you can find many examples, and you raised one. I don't know that issue. But you can find many examples where it's been misused. Equally within the EU, you can find many examples. If I delved into the history of the UNDP, I'd find many examples. If I looked into the Lithuanian government, I'd find many examples. If I looked into the Vilnius city government, I'd find examples. Anywhere you go in the world, you will find public institutions that have failed for many reasons, because we are human, and that's what we do really, really well. We screw things up, but also we've got a great record of doing things wonderfully. And I don't think we can allow the screw-ups, the inevitable screw-ups. And we were talking about the UN always getting criticized. The UN will always screw up. We'll never have a world in which we have a perfect global government. It will always screw up. But we have to believe that it's better than the opposite, which is increased isolationism, reduced public spending on the things we care about, increased nationalism. So it's always a balance. But we have to persuade those that believe that this money is wasted, that it's not, that it can make a great difference. And in fact, I wrote a book called The Trouble with Aid, as you mentioned earlier, which was an argument that the relationship of receiving money and public money is really complex. But that doesn't mean we don't need it, and especially as we're facing the challenge of climate crisis. And I mentioned the Second World War earlier as one of the ways that boosted the European Union. You know, tragically, human beings tend to respond to crises. So rather than get ready for them and organize ourselves, we tend to respond when they happen. So I'm really hoping that this time we're able to deal with the climate crisis and respond in a publicly led way before it gets even worse. And I know people are already suffering from climate change, but it could certainly get worse. So I think this is the time to really believe in that. And then finally, yeah, I rather flippantly said you should travel more. I think many of us who have spent our time going around the world, and people who live in the global south and in the global north, they do realize that there are so many different ways of being a human, of responding to the challenges we face, of building economies, that the answers that are now associated with Western Enlightenment actually were originally found, and you can read this brilliant book by David Graeber called The Dawn of Everything, were originally found in indigenous societies in Latin America and North America. This kind of sharing of knowledge across the world is not, I'm not proposing a new thing. It's happened for centuries. Of course it has. And the very people that sometimes are recipient of so much racism today, racism in all ways, but the Arab world is treated with such racism in many parts of Europe. These were the great visionaries and philosophers and mathematicians of of modern times. And I think that you know, there is an element of sharing and education that we have to do to remember that I really profoundly disagree with the implication of what the gentleman said, that there is little to learn from other parts of the world. And that's my personal experience, but it's also, I believe, what intellectual reading will demonstrate, that all parts of the world do indeed have a lot to offer each other.
Thank you very much.
I just wanted to add on that question, and maybe also yours, just a few thoughts. I think part of the question that you asked was, what is the return of investment, right? Why do developed countries or wealthier countries have to invest in other countries? And I think we talked a lot about the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement and the global public goods, right? It's about the future of our world in general. But if you look at it, and it's not only environment and climate change that you already mentioned, but it's also stability, social cohesion. If you look at how public spending is done in ODA, the ODA development assistance, only 4% of the global ODA is going to preventing crisis, which means strengthening governments, institutions, social cohesion. The rest is going to respond to crisis. Because if you don't invest in prevention, then there's more crises that you have to respond to. And that money will come eventually from the budgets of the developed countries increasingly, and other countries as well. So it's self-enlightenment, if you ask me. It's about also protecting your countries, but making sure that you contribute to the global future of all, because there are migratory pressures also. There are social cohesion issues. There are wars happening everywhere. It's because we need to invest more in the development of all the countries to make sure that we are living in the future we want. But also the role of the public development funding. And I think the example of the camps is a very good one, because this is where there needs to be more understanding about the humanitarian development nexus. You referenced a lot of funding that is going to humanitarian things, giving people food packages or making sure that they stay in camps. But there's not enough discussion about what is the role of development funding, public funding, to make sure that those people are integrated, that they have jobs. That is coming also with the private sector. The role of the public funding is to be seed funding towards making sure that we have the right incentive in place, policies in place, to bring foreign companies, for instance, or other companies, to make sure that these people are sufficiently prepared to get a job, their human rights are respected, and so on. So I think the development side of things is usually ignored in this equation. And if you look at how funding is now being dispersed, there's a lot of funding that is going to development, to humanitarian crisis, and normally because we have more humanitarian problems to deal with. But the development funding, which has been increasing but not to the same proportion as the humanitarian funding, is going increasingly to loans. And that is the problem. There's no grants. The level of grants that is going to development priorities is decreasing. Most of the money is going through the IFIs, the financial institutions, that is putting an additional pressure on these governments that are already indebted. So they cannot contribute to the level of their power, of their ambition, of their intention to what you were describing, to the circular economy because of the pressures that they have, also coming from loans. So I think we need to also look at the balance between loans and grants, where the funding is going, and how to make it more efficient going forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much for extensive answers. And I think that we received many questions, but we cannot answer all the questions due to our time limitations. But it seems the topic is very challenging and thought-provoking, and unfortunately we cannot extend it anymore. But thank you very much, Jonathan, for your interesting and innovative approach and challenging the world structures as they are today we inherited from the past century thinkers, but we need to think forward to give it to the hands of our students, of our new generation, to develop it further and to serve our people, our civilization as one global nation, to enhance cooperation, to enhance trust, mutual understanding, to challenge each other, but to behave in a safe and peaceful environment. So I would like to say goodbye to our online audience, but we can continue the discussions here in this room by the coffee. Thank you very much.